I'm taking you home, now.
What? This is my party, you can't just crash it.
I can, and I am. You underestimated me.
This is ridiculous.
Let's go, we're leaving.
Her husband was trending again. Another party, another woman, another headline. And while the entire city was watching the Korean billionaire smile for cameras, his wife was sitting alone in a penthouse carrying a secret nobody knew. 4 pregnancies, 4 losses. 4 times she stayed silent. Not because she didn't care, because she loved him. But tonight, she did something nobody expected. She put on a black dress, walked into the billionaire's private party uninvited, crossed a room full of cameras, looked at the women standing beside her husband, and said one sentence that made the entire ballroom go silent. Not a scream, not a threat, just, "I came to take my husband home." What happened next destroyed every headline they thought they knew, because this was never a story about cheating. It was a story about 2 people who loved each other so deeply, they forgot to say it. And by the end of this night, only one of them realized they were losing everything. She didn't wear red. Every woman who had ever tried to reclaim a man in a room full of witnesses wore red. Because red said, "Look at me." Red said, "I came to fight." Red said, "I dressed for your attention and I want everyone to know it." Red was a declaration. Red was theater. Red was exactly what the tabloids were hoping for. Nyla wore black, not because she was mourning, not because she was being dramatic in the quiet, sophisticated way that required a fashion editor to explain it to you 3 days later. She wore black because she was a structural engineer, and structural engineers understood load-bearing. She needed something that could carry the weight of what she was about to do without collapsing on the elevator ride up. The party was on the 42nd floor of the Lot Jeju Tower, the kind of venue that existed specifically to make ordinary people feel like background characters in someone else's life. Crystal chandeliers that probably had their own insurance policies, waitstaff moving with the choreographed precision of people who had been trained to be invisible and were very good at their jobs. Investors standing in clusters, laughing at things that weren't funny because laughter in those circles was a form of currency. And in the center of all of it, because of course he was in the center, because Kang Jun-sok had never once in his adult life stood near a wall unless he was being photographed against it, was her husband. He was wearing the gray suit, the one she had picked. She almost laughed. She had laid that suit out on the bed 4 days ago, before she'd made her decision, before she'd called her mother in Lagos and sat on the kitchen floor listening to the sound of a woman who had survived 3 decades of hard things telling her quietly, "Nyla, you cannot keep being a house that nobody comes home to." She had laid out that suit because old habits are essentially just loyalty with nowhere to go, and 6 years of marriage meant her hands still knew his wardrobe better than he did. He was wearing it with a woman on his left side, not draped on him, not holding his arm, just adjacent. The careful proximity of someone auditioning for a role that hadn't officially been posted yet. She was beautiful in the architectural way that required significant financial investment, the kind of beautiful that came with a team. She laughed at something Jun-sok said and touched his sleeve briefly, the way women touch expensive things they're considering purchasing. Nyla watched from the entrance for exactly 30 seconds. Nobody noticed her. This was historically the story of her life. She moved through spaces quietly, had always moved through spaces quietly, ever since she was a 7-year-old in Lagos who finished her examinations early and sat with her hands folded while the other children were still writing, because drawing attention to your speed was considered impolite, and being impolite was the only thing her mother considered unforgivable. She had arrived in Seoul 11 years ago speaking Korean. She had learned from textbooks and stubbornness, had passed her engineering boards in a language that was not her first or her second, had built a career in a field that still occasionally looked at her with the slow blink of a system encountering an unexpected variable. And still, somehow, she moved through rooms like weather. Present. Consequential. Unannounced. Jun-sok's security team clocked her at the entrance and let her through without a word. She was still in the system. She was still, technically, Mrs. Kang. That would have been funny if it hadn't been so precisely sad. She took a glass of water from a passing tray, not champagne water, because she needed her hands to be steady and her mind to be clear and her body to behave like the load-bearing structure it was. And she began crossing the ballroom. She watched him see her. It happened the way she'd expected. The almost imperceptible shift in his face, a microsecond of something that in a lesser man would have been panic, in Kang Jun-sok translated as a slight tightening around the eyes. His jaw held, his smile recalibrated. By the time she was 12 feet away, he had already rebuilt the expression into something polite and controlled, and about as emotionally informative as a glass wall. The woman beside him noticed her, looked her up and down with the leisurely confidence of someone who did not yet understand what they were looking at. The room did what rooms full of wealthy people at parties always do when something interesting happens. It pretended not to notice while noticing everything. Nyla stopped in front of her husband. He said, "Nyla." Polite. Careful. The voice he used for board members he didn't entirely trust. She looked at him for a long moment, really looked. The way you look at a building you designed when you return to it years later and check the walls for stress fractures. And then she reached forward and adjusted his tie. The room went very still. She had done this 10,000 times. Every morning, every event, every conference and dinner and function where he had stood still, while her hands straightened the one part of him that consistently refused to stay level. It was muscle memory. It was 6 years. It was the most ordinary thing she had ever done, and in this room at this moment, it was the most devastating. He didn't move. She smoothed the tie flat, stepped back, and said very quietly, "Are you done?" And somewhere in the back of the room, a woman whispered something to her companion, and the compound interest on 4 years of silence came due all at once. The woman in red would have screamed. Nyla came in black and said less and broke more. Do you think Jun Sok deserved a second chance, or was Nyla already too late? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you believe a woman's silence should never be mistaken for weakness, hit subscribe. Only the ones who've been underestimating her won't. The woman beside Jun Sok laughed. It was a small laugh, barely a sound, really, more of an exhale dressed up in social clothing, but it was loud enough. The kind of laugh that was designed to do one specific thing: remind everyone in the immediate vicinity that she was unbothered, and that unbothered people had the power in this situation, and that the quietly dressed woman who had just materialized from nowhere and adjusted a married man's tie like she was returning a library book was, in her professional assessment, not a threat. Her name was Oh Soo-yeon. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a pharmaceutical chairman, and she had spent the better part of 3 months learning Jun Sok's schedule with the dedication of someone studying for a final examination they intended to pass with distinction. She knew which events he attended. She knew which charities he donated to in public and which ones he funded quietly. She knew he took his coffee without sugar and his meetings without small talk and his solitude without apology. What she did not know, what nobody had bothered to brief her on, possibly because nobody considered it relevant, was that the woman standing in front of him right now had once rebuilt a structurally compromised bridge in Incheon that 3 senior engineers had declared unsalvageable. Nyla did not look at her. This was somehow worse than being looked at. Jun Sok said nothing for 3 full seconds. In boardroom terms, 3 seconds of silence from Kang Jun Sok meant someone's quarterly projections were about to be rejected. In personal terms, in the terms that Nyla had spent 6 years learning to read like a second language, 3 seconds meant he was recalibrating, deciding which version of himself to present, choosing his architecture. "You came," he finally said. "I came," she agreed. "I wasn't aware you were attending. I wasn't aware I needed to send advance notice to see my husband." Soo-yeon's smile tightened approximately 2 millimeters. Nobody noticed except Nyla, who noticed everything. Always, quietly, in the way of people who have spent years in rooms where nobody spoke directly and so learned to read everything else instead. Jun Sok's jaw moved. "This isn't the place." "I know." Nyla took a small sip of her water. "I didn't come for a place. I came for an answer." "Nyla, you look tired," she said, and she meant it, not as an insult, not as the opening move of a calculated cruelty. She looked at her husband and she saw, beneath the gray suit and the practiced stillness and the 42 floors of curated success, a man who looked like he had not slept properly in months. His eyes carried the specific kind of exhaustion that no amount of money could negotiate with. The kind that lived behind the eyes rather than under them, the kind that came not from overwork but from carrying something heavy in a direction nobody could see. She recognized it. She had seen it in her own mirror. Jun Sok blinked. And for one unguarded moment, one fraction of a second that his training and his upbringing and his 12 years of running a conglomerate could not fully suppress, he looked at his wife like a man who had been alone in a language nobody else spoke and had just heard one familiar word. Soo-yeon cleared her throat. The moment closed. Jun Sok straightened. "I have guests." "You do," Nyla said pleasantly. "Several of them are watching us right now and pretending to be interested in the canapes. The canapes, I should mention, are not that interesting. I had one near the door. Someone behind them coughed over a laugh." Jun Sok stared at her. She stared back. This was the thing about Nyla Bryan Kang that people consistently failed to understand, that her quietness had never been weakness. It had been precision. She was a woman who had learned that if you spoke less, people eventually filled the silence with everything you needed to know about them. She had spent 6 years listening to her husband not say things, and she had cataloged every single omission with the systematic thoroughness of a woman who had once memorized the load tolerances of 40 different grades of structural steel because lives depended on getting it right. She knew him. She knew him the way you know a building you designed. Every beam, every fault line, every place where the foundation had been poured correctly, and every place where someone had cut a corner and hoped nobody would notice until long after the certificate of occupancy was signed. "Who is she?" Soo-yeon asked, directly, boldly, with the confidence of a woman who had been told her whole life that boldness was an asset. Nyla turned and looked at her for the first time, full attention, unhurried. The way engineers look at a structure they are assessing, not unkindly, simply thoroughly. "I'm the architect," Nyla said. Soo-yeon blinked. "Excuse me?" "Of this." Nyla gestured, a small economical gesture that somehow managed to indicate Jun-sok, the suit, the party, the entire preceding 6 years. "I helped build it. I know where all the weak points are." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Jun-sok's glass had stopped moving halfway to his mouth. Soo-yeon looked at him, waiting for him to intervene, to rescue, to perform the function she had been standing beside him all evening to make necessary. He said nothing. Because Kang Jun-sok, for all his capability, for all his controlled precision, was currently experiencing the particular paralysis of a man who has spent 2 years convincing himself a story, and has just watched the actual story walk across a ballroom in a black dress and adjust his tie. Nyla set her water glass down on the nearest tray. She smoothed the front of her dress once, with the same economy of movement she applied to everything. "I came to take my husband home," she said. To him. Not to the room, not to Soo-yeon. To him, with the quiet directness of someone saying something they have been rehearsing for months and have finally decided, tonight, is worth the cost of saying. Jun-suk looked at his wife, and underneath the gray suit she had chosen, underneath the control he had been maintaining for 3 months at considerable personal expense, something moved. Not enough. Not yet. But it moved. The thing about billionaires at parties is that they are never actually at parties. They are at negotiations that have been dressed up in chandelier lighting and passed off as social events, because calling something a party makes people lower their guard, and lowered guards are, in the financial ecosystem, worth considerably more than raised ones. Every conversation was a transaction. Every laugh was an investment. Every glass raised in someone's direction was a calculated allocation of goodwill toward a future return. Jun-sok had attended 412 of these events in the last 6 years. Nyla had attended 19. She had stopped coming not because she was asked to stop, not because there had been a conversation or a ruling or a formal decree issued from the Kang household. There had been no such conversation, because having the conversation would have required both of them to admit something was wrong, and they were both, professionally and personally, committed to the structural integrity of surfaces. She had stopped coming because after the second loss, standing in rooms full of laughing, people had started to feel like being underwater and pretending to breathe normally, and she was a precise woman who did not perform things she could not execute correctly. So she had stayed home. And Jun-sok had learned to arrive alone and leave with headlines. It was in the grand tradition of their marriage, a system that worked for everyone except the 2 people inside it. The room had not returned to normal. Rooms never return to normal after something real happens inside them. They just redistribute the tension into smaller containers and call it cocktail conversation. People had shifted. Clusters had reformed with new orientations, the way iron filings rearrange themselves around a magnet. Half the room was discussing the Kang Group's latest acquisition in tones that suggested they had not just witnessed anything of personal significance. The other half was on their phones with the particular hunched urgency of people texting someone who was not in the room but absolutely needed to know. Oh, Soo-yeon was still standing there. This, Nyla reflected, showed either considerable courage or a fundamental misreading of the situation. Possibly both. The girl was 26. She had looked her up, not out of jealousy, but out of the same professional instinct that made her read the soil reports before designing a foundation. Know what you're building on. Know what you're building against. Soo-yeon was not a bad person. She was simply a person who had been handed incomplete information and had made reasonable decisions based on it. Someone had told her, through the language of Jun-sok's consistent availability, his attendance at her father's functions, his willingness to be photographed in her vicinity, that the position was open, that the wife was a ghost, that the marriage was a legal formality maintained for tax efficiency and public optics. People had told her things that Jun-sok's behavior had not contradicted. That was on him. Nyla understood this with the clarity she understood most things, structurally, systemically, without the fog of personalizing what was actually architectural. The building had been poorly managed. That was a facilities problem, not a foundation problem, probably. She was still deciding. Soo-yeon-si, Nyla said, and the girl startled slightly at being addressed by name, because of course she startled, because being known by a woman you had been pretending didn't fully exist was its own particular shock. Your father's company is currently under review for the Jeju Biotech tender. Soo-yeon stiffened. I'm aware. My firm consulted on 3 of the infrastructure specifications in that tender. Nyla's voice was conversational, pleasant even. The tone of someone discussing weather patterns or restaurant recommendations. The review board meets in 6 weeks. The silence stretched. I'm not threatening you, Nyla added with the calm of a woman who didn't need to threaten anyone because the information was simply true, and truth had its own particular weight. I'm introducing myself properly, since we weren't introduced earlier. Junsok was staring at his wife with an expression she had never seen on him before. It took her a moment to identify it. It was awe, not attraction, though that was also there. Somewhere beneath the layers of guilt and guardedness, she could see it the way you see load stress in a beam before it becomes visible to the naked eye. It was awe. The specific awe of a man who has been underestimating something for years and has just watched that something demonstrate its actual capacity. Soo-yeon looked between them once. Then she picked up her clutch, excused herself with a graciousness that Nyla genuinely respected, and walked toward the far end of the room where her own circle would close around her and absorb the evening's events. She would be fine. Young, wealthy, beautiful, and now considerably better informed about the importance of complete information before entering a situation. She would be absolutely fine. Junsok exhaled. It was not a loud sound. It was barely a sound at all. But Nyla heard it, heard the specific texture of it, the way it carried something that had been held too long. And she filed it carefully in the part of her that was still, despite everything, paying attention to him. You didn't have to do that, he said. I know. Then why? Because she deserved to know who was in the room. Nyla looked at him steadily. So did you once. He flinched. There it was. She hadn't come to wound him. She had genuinely not come for that, because wounds required ongoing proximity to fester, and she was not sure she had the proximity left to give. But the truth had edges. It always had edges. You could deliver it gently and it still cut, because that was the nature of true things, and she had spent 4 years avoiding true things, because the cuts had started to feel unsurvivable. She was done avoiding. I need a drink, Junsok said quietly. Not to a waiter, to her, the way he used to say things directly, without performance, in the register he reserved for 3 a.m. conversations about architecture and ambition. Water, Nyla said. You've had enough of whatever that was. He looked at his glass, looked at her. You've been watching me. I've always been watching you, she said simply. You stopped noticing. The chandelier above them scattered light across the floor in fragments, expensive, brilliant, and broken into pieces. And Junsok Kang stood in the middle of his own party and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like a man who was being seen entirely. It was uncomfortable. It was also, somewhere beneath the discomfort, the closest thing to relief he had felt since he could remember. They found a corner. Not together, not deliberately, not with the coordinated intention of 2 people who had decided to have a conversation. It happened the way most true things happened between them, without announcement, without negotiation, with the quiet inevitability of 2 structures built on the same foundation finally transmitting force to each other after years of pretending the connection had been severed. Junsok moved toward the east window. Nyla followed at a distance that could be described by anyone watching as coincidental. The room noted this and recalibrated its gossip trajectories accordingly. Outside the glass, Jeju City glittered in the way of coastal cities at night, indifferent, luminous, entirely unbothered by the human architecture being stress-tested 42 floors above it. Junsok spoke first. You look thin. You look guilty, she said. He accepted this the way he accepted balance sheets that contained bad news, without visible reaction, with the internal recalibration of a man deciding which numbers to address first. How long have you been planning this? He asked. I didn't plan it. She looked at the city below them. I decided it. There's a difference. Planning requires optimism about the future. I just decided the present had gone on long enough. He was quiet for a moment. The party continued behind them. The laughter, the transactions, the careful choreography of people performing ease they did not feel. It was remarkable, Nyla thought, how much energy human beings spent pretending, entire economies of effort directed entirely at the maintenance of surfaces. She and Junseok had been a two-person economy of exactly this kind for 2 years. The fourth time, Junseok said, her breath caught. Not visibly. She was too precise for visible breath-catching. But internally, in the part of her that she had walled off and insulated and reinforced with the specific thoroughness of a woman who had learned that soft things in exposed positions did not survive, something shifted. He had never brought it up first. In 9 months, he had never once brought it up first. What about it, she said. Not a question. A surface she was offering him, to see whether he would stand on it or walk past it the way he had walked past every other open door in the last 2 years. I wasn't there. No. I should have been. Yes. The monosyllables were not coldness. They were the careful architecture of a woman who had learned that giving a man too many words to respond to meant he could choose the easy ones and avoid the structural ones, and she was not here tonight for easy. Junseok turned from the window. She kept looking at the city. I knew it was coming, he said. The timeline. Dr. Shin had told us there were risks with the cerclage, that the 3rd trimester was. I knew. And I was in Busan, in a meeting about a port development that has since been delayed by 18 months for reasons entirely outside my control, which I find, he stopped, which I find appropriately punishing. Nyla turned to look at him. This was new. In 6 years, Kang Junseok had apologized correctly many times. He was excellent at apologies, precise, timely, appropriately weighted, delivered with the kind of eye contact that communicated sincerity and cost him very little. She had received many of those apologies and accepted them because they were structurally sound even when they were emotionally hollow. This was not one of those apologies. This was a man saying something that was costing him something, and the cost was visible, and he had not yet asked her to make it easier for him. She was listening. I told myself, he continued, that you were strong enough to handle it, that you preferred handling things alone, that you had built walls, and you built them deliberately, and the respectful thing, the thing you actually wanted, was for me to stay on the other side of them. That, Nyla said quietly, was a very convenient thing to tell yourself. I know. Strong enough to handle it. She repeated the phrase with the care of someone examining a load-bearing beam that has been installed upside down. Junseok. I was alone in a hospital room. I called you from the floor of a bathroom. Being strong enough to survive something is not the same as being built to survive it alone. Concrete is strong. Concrete still cracks under sustained load without support. He looked at her. She looked back. I'm an engineer, she said. I have been trying to explain our marriage to you in the only language I have. You never listened. I didn't know you were speaking. I know. And her voice, for the first time all evening, carried something other than steadiness. Not tears. She had decided before leaving the house that she was not performing grief tonight. That grief had been performed in private for 4 years and had accomplished nothing and deserved its privacy. But something, a fracture line. The kind that only appears under magnification, only to people who know where to look. Junseok knew where to look. He had always known. He had simply, for 2 years, been deliberately not looking. Because looking meant seeing, and seeing meant knowing, and knowing meant he had no more comfortable distances left to maintain. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Nyla felt the shift in him, the specific tension of a person approaching a true thing they have been carrying at considerable personal expense for a long time. I went to see Dr. Shin, he said. After the 3rd time, alone. She went very still. The results, he stopped, started again. The issue wasn't only yours, Nyla, it was partly mine. A chromosomal factor. Dr. Shin said it was, that with the right intervention, with the right... He stopped again. The city below them continued its indifferent glittering. You knew, she said, slowly, processing it the way she processed structural data, methodically, without rushing to conclusions before the full picture was assembled. You knew, and you didn't tell me. Yes. I spent 2 years believing my body. She stopped. Yes. Junseok. I know. The word landed between them like a dropped structural column, heavy, final, reshaping everything around the impact point. She didn't yell. She turned back to the window. And the silence between them became, for the first time in 2 years, not the silence of 2 people who had stopped talking, but the silence of 2 people who had finally, at enormous cost, said the true thing. Silence, Nyla had learned, was not one thing. It had textures, temperatures, structural properties that varied depending on what it was built around and what it was designed to hold. There was the silence of hospital rooms, which was soft and terrible and smelled like fluorescent lighting and other people's grief. There was the silence of their apartment at 6 in the morning when Junseok had already left, and she sat with her coffee and the specific quiet of a space that had been occupied but not inhabited. There was the silence of 4 years of choosing not to speak, because speaking required softness, and softness required trust, and trust required a man who stayed. This silence was different. This silence was the kind that came after demolition, after the controlled collapse of a structure that had been compromised so long that bringing it down cleanly was actually the most precise thing you could do. It was not comfortable. Demolition was never comfortable. But it was honest, and in Nyla's professional and personal experience, honest was the only foundation worth building on. She stood at the window for a long time. Junseok did not try to fill the silence. This was, she noted, the first intelligent thing he had done all evening. He stood beside her, not too close, not at the careful diplomatic distance he had been maintaining for 2 years, but in the proximity of someone who had decided that distance was no longer serving any useful structural purpose. Below them, Jeju City continued existing with magnificent indifference. "How long did Dr. Shin know?" she finally asked. "He told me the same week I found out. And you decided. I decided you had enough." His voice was low, rough in the way of things that have been smooth for too long and have finally encountered friction. "You were already carrying so much, Nyla. You had the 3rd loss, and I watched you in that hospital when I finally arrived, and you looked at me and you said you were fine, and I knew you weren't fine, and I thought," he exhaled slowly, "I thought that adding my failure to your grief would be, I thought I was protecting you." Nyla turned to look at him. "You thought," she said carefully, "that keeping information about my own body, my own losses, my own 4 years of believing I was the sole reason we kept losing, you thought keeping that from me was protection." He held her gaze. "Yes. Junseok." She said his name the way she said the names of things she was trying to understand rather than condemn. "That is the most expensive kindness anyone has ever done me, and I need you to understand that it cost me things I cannot invoice you for." He flinched. "Good," said the part of her that had been sitting in white rooms alone, the part of her that had rebuilt herself after 4 losses with the grim architectural thoroughness of a woman who had no other option. That part was not interested in his comfort tonight. That part had been waiting 2 years to be heard and was not prepared to be gracious about the invoice. But there was another part. The part that had watched him cross a ballroom in a gray suit she had chosen, wearing a tie she had straightened, looking like a man who had been punishing himself in the specific private way of people who were raised to believe that suffering quietly was the same as making amends. That part was listening differently. "Why are you telling me now?" she asked. "Because you came." He looked at her with an exhaustion so complete it had passed through tired and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. "Because you walked in here tonight and you adjusted my tie and you asked me if I was done, and I realized—" He stopped. "What?" she said. "That I had been waiting for you to leave." His jaw moved. "For 2 years. Every event, every headline, I kept waiting for the call from your lawyer. And when it didn't come, I told myself it was because you didn't care enough to bother. Because it was easier to believe you had stopped loving me than to believe you were waiting for me to become someone worth staying for." The chandelier light reached them even here at the edge of the room, scattered, fragmented, catching on surfaces at angles that made ordinary things look briefly extraordinary. Nyla was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I bought a yellow book." He looked at her. "After the 3rd time. Before, actually, when we still thought," she stopped, recalibrated. "It had a yellow cover, about raising bilingual children. I read the first chapter on the way home from the bookshop, and I thought," she stopped again. "I put it in the drawer after. I haven't opened the drawer." Junseok said nothing. "I haven't opened the drawer," she repeated, "but I also haven't moved the book. I need you to understand what that means." He understood. He understood in the way of people who have been fluent in a language they pretended not to speak, the language of her silences, her gestures, her precise and devastating restraint. He understood that a woman who had decided to leave entirely would have moved the book, would have emptied the drawer, would have applied the same methodical thoroughness to her exit that she applied to everything else. The book was still there. "I have a son," Junseok said suddenly. Nyla stared at him. "Not," he said quickly, reading her expression with the accuracy of a man who had spent 6 years learning her face even when he pretended not to be looking. "Not what you're thinking. My brother's son, Kang Taeyang, he's 4. My brother died 18 months ago. I don't think I told you we weren't. We weren't speaking by then. You didn't tell me your brother died." "No." "Junseok?" She said his name like a structural assessment. 2 syllables, complete. "Devastating. I know. You have been carrying your brother's death and a medical diagnosis and whatever it is you have been doing at these events for 2 years. I haven't touched anyone," he said, directly. Without the diplomatic cushioning he usually applied to uncomfortable truths. I need you to know that. The photographs, the adjacency, he chose his words with unusual care. I was performing availability I didn't feel, because I thought you were performing indifference you didn't feel. And we are apparently two people who are extraordinarily talented at performing things to an audience of each other. The party moved behind them. Someone's laugh was too loud near the bar. Nyla looked at her husband, really looked, the full assessment look she had deployed at the beginning of the evening, but now with different information, new load calculations, revised structural data, and she felt something shift in her chest that she had been bracing against for 2 years. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness was a building. It required a foundation, and foundations required time, and she was an engineer who did not rush foundations regardless of how urgently the rest of the structure needed to exist. But the ground was there. She could feel it. Taeyang, she said quietly. Your nephew. He looks like my brother. Junsok's voice changed on this, dropped a register, lost its precision, became briefly the voice of a person rather than a position. He's with my housekeeper currently. He has been with me for 8 months. You've had a 4-year-old in our apartment for 8 months. In the East Wing, Yes. Nyla looked at him for a long, quiet moment. You have been alone in that apartment, she said slowly, with your dead brother's child, carrying a medical diagnosis you were too afraid to tell me, watching me move through our home like a ghost, and you didn't. She stopped. Junsok, you are the most aggressively, catastrophically, impressively bad at asking for help of any person I have ever met in my professional or personal life. Something moved on his face. It took her a moment to recognize it. He was trying not to smile, the audacity of it. The absolute, specific, infuriating audacity, and yet she felt it too, rising in her chest like something that had been submerged for years and had finally found a surface to break through. Not happiness. Not yet. But its precursor, the thing that existed just before happiness. When the rubble has been cleared and the ground has been confirmed solid, and someone looks at you in the specific way, that means they know exactly what you're built of. I'm asking now, he said quietly, if it's not too late. She looked at him. Outside, Jeju City glittered. Inside, a marriage stood on new ground for the first time in 2 years, not repaired, not rebuilt, but cleared. Honest. Structurally naked in the way that only true things could be, and waiting, with the patience of good foundations, for whatever came next. The party ended the way all parties ended. Not dramatically, not with a clear conclusion, but with a gradual thinning, like an argument losing conviction. The investors departed in careful clusters. The waitstaff began the quiet archaeology of clearing glasses. The chandeliers continued their indifferent brilliance over a room that was now mostly furniture and leftover ambition. Nyla and Junsok were still at the window. They had not moved in 40 minutes. Nobody had approached them. Whether this was because Junsok's security team had quietly established a perimeter, or because the assembled guests possessed enough social intelligence to recognize that what was happening in that corner was not a conversation to interrupt, or because 42 floors of expensive real estate had finally produced something worth leaving alone, Nyla neither knew nor particularly cared. She was thinking about a 4-year-old boy in the East Wing. This was the thing about new information. It didn't simply add to your existing understanding, it retroactively restructured everything before it, the way discovering a hidden load-bearing wall changed the renovation plans for an entire building. 8 months. Junsok had been sharing their apartment with his dead brother's child for 8 months, and she had been in that same apartment, moving through it like weather, present, consequential, unannounced. And she had not known, which meant he had been keeping the child from her, or protecting the child from the version of their marriage that currently existed. She was not yet sure which, and she was precise enough to know the difference mattered. Tell me about your brother, she said. Junsok looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected this particular door to open tonight and was momentarily uncertain whether he trusted the floor on the other side of it. Kang Junhee, he said finally. He was 3 years younger than me. He was, a pause, he was the version of me that our father considered the failed experiment. Too soft, too interested in things that didn't generate revenue. He painted. Watercolors, mostly. Our father considered this approximately as useful as being fluent in a language nobody spoke. What language did he paint in? Junsok looked at her. He stopped. That's exactly the kind of question he would have asked. What happened to him? Heart condition. Congenital. We didn't know until... Another pause. Longer. The kind that had furniture in it. He collapsed in his studio 18 months ago. Taeyang was there. He was 2.5. He sat with his father for 4 hours before the neighbor found them. The city outside offered nothing useful. It simply continued being a city. Jun Sok, Nyla said. Taeyang doesn't speak much, he continued, with the momentum of a person who has opened a door and understood that stopping halfway through was structurally worse than completing the motion. The doctors say it's situational, trauma response, selective mutism. They expect it to resolve. He communicates. He draws, actually. Like his father, he draws constantly. A brief pause. He drew a picture of me last month. I appeared to be a rectangle. Nyla's mouth moved. A rectangle, she repeated. A very tall rectangle, with what I believe were arms. My housekeeper said it was an excellent likeness. And there it was, the thing that had existed between them in the early years, before the losses accumulated and the silences calcified, and they both retreated into their separate architectures of coping. This specific frequency. This particular wavelength of humor that wasn't performed for an audience but existed because two people who found the same things quietly devastating also tended to find the same things quietly absurd. And sometimes those things were the same thing. Nyla laughed. It was small, brief. The kind of laugh that surprised the person producing it, that arrived before the decision to laugh had been fully processed, that bypassed the armor entirely because it was too quick for armor to intercept. Junsok watched it happen with the expression of a man witnessing something he had been afraid he might never see again. He'll need stability, Nyla said when the laugh had settled. Back to the ground, back to the structural. Children who have experienced early trauma they need consistency, routine, a home that feels like a home rather than a managed space. I know. You've been trying to provide that alone. I've been, he considered this, attempting it, with, I think we can agree, the wholehearted commitment and deeply mixed results of a man whose primary qualification for the task is that he also lost his father young and has strong opinions about which rectangle best represents paternal authority. Junsok. Yes, that child needs more than a rectangle, I'm aware. He needs, she stopped herself. She stopped herself because she knew where the sentence was going and she was not ready to arrive there yet. Not tonight. Tonight had already required more structural load than she had budgeted for when she put on the black dress and told her driver the name of the hotel. She had come for an answer and she had received several, which was characteristic of situations involving Jun Sok. Ask one question. Receive an entire building worth of information, none of it load tested. But the sentence was there. She could feel its weight. He needs what we lost. She did not say it. She said instead, I want to meet him. Jun Sok went very still. Nyla. Not tonight, she said. Not dramatically. I want to meet him the way children should be met. Quietly. Without agenda. I want to know what he draws when he isn't drawing rectangles. Jun Sok looked at her for a long time. In the diminishing light of the emptying ballroom, with the chandeliers beginning their dimming cycle and the city continuing its coastal indifference 42 floors below, he looked at his wife, really looked, with the full attention of a man who had spent 2 years looking away and had discovered tonight that the cost of looking away was compounding at a rate his balance sheet could not sustain. Why? He asked. Not suspicious, not guarded. Genuinely asking, in the register of a man who needed to understand the load before he trusted the floor. Nyla looked at him with the steadiness that had carried her through 4 hospital rooms and 6 years of marriage and one devastating party on the 42nd floor of a hotel overlooking a city that had never once asked for her opinion. Because, she said simply, someone should. The last chandelier dimmed. The room exhaled. Outside, Jeju City glittered on, magnificent and indifferent, while inside, something that had been broken for 2 years turned, slowly, carefully, at significant structural cost, towards something that might, with time and honesty and the specific stubborn precision of a woman who did not abandon compromised buildings when they were worth saving, become whole. Junsok reached forward. Not for her hand. Not yet. That was a floor that needed more testing before either of them trusted their weight to it. He reached forward and adjusted his own tie, badly. The way he always adjusted it without her, crooked, slightly left of center, optimistic in its intention, and catastrophic in its execution. He looked at her, she looked at his tie, she straightened it. One last time. And said nothing because some things did not require words. Because sometimes the most structurally sound statement two people could make to each other was a gesture so ordinary and so loaded that it contained everything the words had failed to carry for 2 years. They left together. Not dramatically. Not with the choreographed exit of two people who understood they were being watched and had decided to perform their reconciliation for the audience that had assembled to witness their demolition. There was no announcement, no gesture toward the remaining guests. Jun-sok simply collected his jacket from the chair where he had abandoned it earlier in the evening, and Nyla walked beside him toward the elevator. And the remaining staff and stragglers noted this with the quiet satisfaction of people who had been present at something true and would be dining on the story for approximately 6 to 8 months. The elevator arrived. They stepped in. The doors closed. For 17 floors, they stood in silence. Not the old silence, not the silence of two people who had run out of things to say and were too exhausted to manufacture new ones, but the silence of two people in the process of recalibrating, of taking new measurements, of standing inside a structure that had been stripped back to its bones and finding, with the cautious relief of experienced builders, that the bones were sound. On the 25th floor, Jun-sok said, "I should have told you about Taeyang immediately." "Yes," Nyla said. "I was afraid you'd—" He stopped. "What?" "That you'd want him." His voice was careful, precise in the specific way of people navigating around something sharp. "That seeing him would— After everything, I thought it would be cruel to put a child in front of you when we hadn't." "When we hadn't what?" she said. "Sorted ourselves out first?" "Yes." She considered this for 3 floors. "That," she said, "is almost a reasonable thought, Jun-sok. You were perhaps 40% of the way to a good decision, and then you went in an entirely wrong direction and stayed there for 8 months. 40%. I'm being generous." The elevator opened at the lobby. They crossed the marble floor, her heels, his footsteps, the quiet industry of a hotel that never fully slept, and passed through the glass doors into the Jeju night. The air was clean in the way of coastal cities after 10 o'clock, salt and dark, and the distant sound of water being entirely indifferent to human complexity. A car was waiting. Jun-sok's driver, who had the professional discretion of a man who had been employed by the Kang household for 11 years and had developed the selective perception of someone who understood that seeing less meant lasting longer. They got in. The city moved past the windows. "I need to say something," Jun-sok said when they were 3 minutes from the apartment. He said it with the particular tone of a man who had been rehearsing a sentence for some time and had decided, tonight of all nights, that rehearsed was better than silent. "Say it," Nyla said. "I have been." He stopped, started again. "I have spent 2 years being a man who was so afraid of being insufficient that he made himself absent instead, because absent is a condition, insufficient is a verdict. And I am," he paused, "I am a man who was raised in a house where verdicts were permanent, and I did not know how to exist inside the possibility that I had failed you completely and that there might still be. Jun-sok, yes. You talk like a press release when you're nervous." He stopped. She looked at him in the dark of the car with the city lights crossing his face in intervals. Light, dark, and she said more quietly, "Just say the true thing." He looked at her. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since you told me, on our 3rd date, that the building I was most proud of had a drainage problem that would manifest in exactly 7 years, and then you produced a napkin on which you had sketched the corrected specification." He paused. "I kept the napkin." Nyla was quiet. "I love you," he said again. "And I have been performing the absence of that because I was ashamed of what I cost you, and shame is, I was not given good tools for shame. My father's tools for shame were distance and productivity, and I used both of them on the person least deserving of either." The car slowed. The apartment building resolved through the windshield. Familiar, tall, the building they had chosen together 6 years ago because Nyla had assessed the structural specifications and approved them, and Jun-sok had approved her approving them, which was the closest either of them had come to romance in the practical early days. "The napkin," she said. "3rd drawer. My office desk. Left side." She absorbed this. She thought about the yellow book in her drawer. She thought about a man keeping a napkin sketch for 6 years in a drawer he never mentioned. She thought about 2 people who expressed love through the preservation of paper, who had somehow spent 2 years failing to tell each other that the paper still existed. "There's a child in the East Wing," she said. "Yes. Who draws rectangles, amongst other shapes. He has recently begun drawing what I believe are horses, though they currently resemble rectangles with ambitions." Her mouth moved again. She held it this time, but only barely. "Jun-sok," she said. "Yes. I am not forgiving you tonight." She said it clearly. Without cruelty, without the performance of coldness, with the simple precision of a woman stating a load calculation. "What you kept from me, the diagnosis, your brother, 8 months of a child in our home, these are not things that resolve in one evening. I need you to understand that what I am offering tonight is not absolution. It is the beginning of an honest conversation that should have started 2 years ago. I understand, he said. I need more than understanding. I need different behavior. I need a man who tells me true things even when the true things are costly, especially when they're costly. I did not marry you to be managed. I married you to be known. He looked at her with the full attention of a man receiving a structural brief and understanding, for the first time, the complete scope of what had been commissioned. Known, he said quietly. Yes. And I need. She stopped. This part was harder. This part required softness, and softness was the thing she had been rationing for 2 years because the supply had nearly run out. I need you to let me grieve. Properly. Not alone. I need you to sit in the room this time, not at the door. I'll sit in the room, he said. I will, Nyla, I will sit in every room. I will sit in the difficult rooms and the quiet rooms and the rooms that smell like hospitals and the rooms where there is nothing to do except be present. I understand now that being present was the thing. That was always the thing, and I kept substituting other competencies for it because presence required me to be insufficient out loud, and his voice shifted. I am asking you to teach me. I am telling you that I do not know how to do this correctly, and I am asking you to not leave while I learn. The car stopped. They sat for a moment in the arrived quiet. Then Nyla said, There is a boy in our East Wing who has not spoken properly in 18 months and draws his guardian as a rectangle. Yes. And you have been alone with this. Yes. That ends tonight, she said. Not warmly, not yet. Warmth was a later stage material. Warmth required a cured foundation, but with the decisive specificity of a woman who had made a structural decision and would not be revisiting it. I'm going in. She opened the car door. The Jeju night received her. Salt air, dark sky, the distant and democratic sound of the ocean declining to have opinions about human complexity. She walked toward the building. Jun Sok was beside her before she reached the door. Not ahead, not behind. Beside, in the specific lateral position of a man who had finally understood that beside was not a demotion, it was the only structurally honest position available to him, and he intended to occupy it without complaint for as long as she would allow. The lobby, the elevator, the 43rd floor. Their door. She put her hand on the handle. He put his hand briefly over hers, not possessively, not dramatically, in the way of someone confirming weight-bearing capacity before committing to a step. She let it stay. She opened the door. The apartment was quiet in the way of late nights and sleeping children and spaces that were waiting to be inhabited properly rather than simply occupied. The East Wing was dark. Somewhere inside it, a 4-year-old boy who drew rectangles with ambitions was sleeping through the most significant structural event his temporary guardian's marriage had experienced in 2 years. Nyla walked in. She stood in the living room of the home she had been moving through like weather for 2 years, and she felt not happiness, not the resolved wholeness of a story that had decided to be tidy, but something true, something load-bearing, the specific quality of ground that has been tested honestly and found, despite damage and compression and sustained weight, still capable of holding. She turned to Jun Suk. Tomorrow, she said, I want to meet Tai Yang. Tomorrow, he said. And you're going to call Dr. Shin, both of us, together. Yes. And you're going to find that napkin tonight and put it somewhere I can see it, because I want to know it exists. He looked at her. The city outside their windows did its city things. Lights, distance, the coastal darkness that made everything look like a beginning. And Jun Sok, she said, yes. Next time you are in a meeting, she said quietly, and something happens that requires you to choose between the meeting and me, I need you to choose correctly, not perfectly, not without cost, just correctly. Correctly, he said, like a man committing a specification to memory. Like a man who understood that this was the foundation and everything else was secondary. Yes, she looked at him one last time that evening. This man she had married on a Tuesday in October. This man who kept napkins and raised rectangles and carried grief in the specific, devastating way of people who had never been taught that grief shared was grief halved, and she made the only decision that had ever truly been available to her. She stayed. Not because she had no options, not because leaving was too difficult or too costly or too much work. She stayed because she was a structural engineer, and structural engineers did not abandon sound buildings simply because the maintenance had been catastrophically deferred, and she had assessed the bones tonight, in the light of a Jeju ballroom and the dark of a coastal car and the quiet of a home that finally had honest air in it, and the bones were sound. They were damaged.